Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a genuinely fascinating biblical contrast between two absolute heavyweights, Abram and Caleb. Now, we're looking at these two men who faced a massive crossroads at the exact same point in their lives. The way their journeys completely diverge from this single moment, well, it offers us an incredible study in contrasting choices, really highlighting the stark difference between relying on our own human effort versus totally trusting in divine timing.
85. This isn't just some random number dropped into the narrative. It's a highly specific, absolutely critical anchor point. It marks the exact moment in time where these two men stood, stared down a promise that seemed indefinitely delayed, and made entirely different choices. Choices that literally echoed through history.
As a beautifully written song from our sources captures perfectly, we are really looking at two contrasting roads here. Listen to these lyrics. One leads to dust. One leads to life. We're comparing the road of human striving, which ultimately just ends in a grave, to the road of steadfast faith that actually saves and restores.
Let's get right into our first section, 85 years old, two diverging paths.
So let's look at this crossroads. At 85, Abram looked at his situation, felt like he just couldn't wait a single second longer for God's promise of an heir, and decided to use a human method to basically force the outcome. But Caleb, at that exact same age, he took the completely opposite route. He fully trusted God's promise and divine strength to conquer the land, instead of relying on his own understanding or his own frantic timetable.
Moving on to Abraham, the limits of human methods.
What's so fascinating here is the deep symbolic meaning behind the method Abram chose. He chose Hagar. Now, according to the text in Galatians, Hagar translates to bondwoman. Spiritually speaking, she represents the absolute limitations of the law, human effort, and fleshly striving. Abram basically tried to accomplish a divine will using a purely earthly human vehicle.
And, well, what was the result of that? By taking matters into his own hands, Abram manufactured a human solution, Ishmael. This was a son born of human might and fleshy planning. It completely bypassed the miraculous nature of God's true promise, creating a massive complication rather than a fulfillment.
The crucial takeaway here is perfectly captured in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. Because Abram relied on the flesh in that moment, the scriptural conclusion is that human effort, or the works of the law, always fall short. He died in faith, absolutely, but regarding that specific instance of human striving, he did not receive the ultimate promise through those fleshly means.
Now let's pivot and look at Caleb's choice, complete trust and obedience. Consider the actual definition of Caleb's name. In Hebrew, it literally means dog. While that often symbolized something lowly or even unclean in ancient contexts, the narrative here completely flips it on its head. In this story, it represents a humble servant whose posture is one of absolute, unwavering devotion. He perfectly follows his master, totally regardless of his own status.
And this leads us to a fascinating redefinition of a word we use a lot, meekness. Caleb totally embodies true biblical meekness. It doesn't just mean being gentle or passive. Actually, think of it more like a wild, incredibly powerful horse that has been completely tamed. It has immense strength, but all that strength is in perfect submission to its rider's commands. That was Caleb, strong but totally under God's authority.
And this brilliantly illustrates the result of his faith. In the book of Joshua, an 85-year-old Caleb boldly declares he is just as strong for battle today as he was at 40. Because he chose the path of faith, God sustained his physical and spiritual strength so he could completely fulfill the promise. He didn't need some human workaround, he had divine endurance. Which brings us to the spiritual meaning within Hebron.
Hebron is the exact spot where these two paths intersect. For Abram, it's the location of the cave of Machpelah, literally his burial site, symbolizing where human efforts and legalistic striving come to an end in death. But for Caleb, Hebron is the vibrant mountain he completely conquered in life and victory at age 85. The exact same location represents the death of human effort for one and the total triumph of faith for the other.
If we map this out, it reveals an incredible spiritual war spanning generations. The battle for Canaan essentially started when an 85-year-old Abram made a mistake, bringing the flesh and human law into the promised land. And yet, the war is effectively ended by another 85-year-old, Caleb, who conquered Hebron and restored the promise through pure, unadulterated faith.
Going right back to those song lyrics from our sources, the war began with Ishmael's cry, but the war is ended by your hand. This narrative is such beautiful proof that despite our human failures, our missteps, and our constant attempts to force things, God's sovereign power ultimately restores and fulfills his covenant. He literally cleans up the messes made by our human hands.
So, the final question, which path will you choose?
Let's summarize the key lessons we can take away from explicitly contrasting these two 85-year-olds. First off, there is a massive difference between forcing your own timing and patiently waiting for God's. Second, relying on our own effort, going the Hagar route, honestly just leads to spiritual delay and a bunch of complications. Third, true strength is meekness, which is power perfectly submitted to God's control. Fourth, it is unwavering faith, exactly like Caleb's, that actually secures the promised inheritance. And finally, the most comforting lesson of all, God's sovereignty is powerful enough to redeem even our biggest past mistakes. The road of faith might require immense patience, for sure, but it guarantees an inheritance that human striving can simply never achieve.
So I'll leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. You and I will inevitably face our own crossroads, our own agonizing delays where we feel like we just can't wait anymore. In those critical moments, which of the two paths will you choose? Will you try to manufacture a human solution that ultimately ends in the dust? Or will you trust the Master's perfect timing and boldly walk the road of life?